I really do like this idea of a cup metaphor when I talk about the capacities, because we've kind of always been like, I'm filling my cup up too much or it's overflowing, but really I think it's 4 cup, all the way from something as small as a shot glass up to a big Stanley cup possibly. Some of us have way more capacity in some things and some of us have much smaller amounts.
Hey, y'all, it's Danny C. Welcome to the Happy Life Agenda podcast. Y'all may not have picked up on this, but I am utterly fascinated by organizational psychology. So when one of my friends recommended Dr. Austin Attaway to join my podcast, I was beyond excited because he is an organizational psychologist, a professor, a TEDx speaker, a CEO, the list goes on and on. So I'm so excited to introduce you to him today. And Dr. Attaway, welcome to the show. I hardly did you justice on your extensive bio. So please tell us a little bit more about you and welcome.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for having me on, Danny. I'm glad to be here and talk about these things with you. Yeah, just I guess a brief on my background. I studied psychology at the University of California, Riverside. That was my bachelor's. And then I moved on to organizational psychology and evaluation for my master's and my Ph.D. at Claremont Graduate University. And just like you said, the list does unfortunately go on. I like to have my hands in a lot of things, from the classroom to working with leaders and business professionals. I also sit on the HR board for the city of Riverside in Southern California. And I have a research lab that studies organizational justice, specifically in the field of organizational psychology. So I'm happy to talk about all of those things, and as well as some of the topics that I've covered in my TEDx talk that I'm continuing some research on and developing a book out of as well.
Amazing. Well, so the question that's on everyone's mind, and it is what you talked about in your TEDx talk, is like, with that extensive list of all the things that you're doing, like, how do you do it? And
Right.
I think, right.
Yeah.
Now more than ever, people are just getting inundated with more and more to do, because not only has technology advanced, but now we have AI, and there's this thing that says that, like, oh, AI can do it all for you. And so one person should be able to do the job of 5 people. I don't know if that's your secret, but I did listen to your TEDx talk. And I think that what you have to share about capacity is going to be phenomenally helpful to so many people, because it's not just about AI. It's really about these pillars that you talk about. So Dr. Attaway, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I will say I am becoming an avid adopter of AI in some of my professional work. I think there are some areas where it's been helping me significantly save some time on routine tasks. And then there's some areas that I think, we still need a little bit of that human touch. I do run a mental health clinic. I don't think AI is going to be coming and taking those jobs anytime soon. But when it comes to capacity and how I sort of juggle all of these things, and like you said, there's a lot of people who their workloads are significantly increasing, either because of the advent of AI or just because of all of life's stressors and the economy, becoming a little bit more tumultuous. These ideas of capacity that I've kind of been building on have come from this idea of bounded rationality. And so I don't want to leave your audience in the dust here. So I'll just kind of briefly cover it. But it's this idea that we're imperfect people. At the end of the day, nobody knows everything. Sometimes we're a little hangry. Sometimes we're tired. Maybe we've just recently gone through a breakup. Maybe things aren't going super well at work. And these things do tap into some of our emotional resources and our cognitive resources, and we're never performing at 100%. So I've really wanted to expand this idea over onto our capacities beyond just rationality. So talking about physical capacity, talking about emotional capacity, cognitive capacity, and social capacity. There's people that are introverts and extroverts, but really it is a spectrum. And so some people are going to benefit some days, going out and hanging out with friends or staying in, and our social capacities really fluctuate. And especially with how more isolated people have become since the pandemic. Physical capacity, for one example, which I touch on in my TED Talk, I have a little mild form of scoliosis, and I'm not necessarily a tall guy, short king, as my students say. And so I'm never going to be drafted into the NBA, even if I want to so badly be in the NBA. And so some of these like harsher realities that I think we need to be more open with ourselves and have a lot more self-compassion around, in that we will not achieve certain things in these areas, but we need to be realistic on what we can achieve and how to build up to that upper limit on any one of these four capacities.
Wow. I love that so much. So let's touch a little bit on, I think in your TED talk, you actually
Yeah.
went a little bit deeper on the physical. One of the pillars of the Happy Life Agenda is intentional wellness. And if you kind of
Yes.
take care of that wellness, then kind of the other things come along. And you use that example is like, you may never be in the NBA, but if you
Mhm.
drink more water, if you work out,
Yeah.
you're going to see those other capacities fill up as well by focusing on that one. So can you touch on that? Because I know for a lot, I particularly focus on women with the Happy
Mhm.
Life Agenda and being moms and working moms, a lot of those other pieces of the puzzle, drain us. And then it makes it hard to be like, oh my gosh, I got to get up an hour earlier to go to the gym. So if you can touch a little bit on that perspective and kind of coach us through some of the ways that touching on one of those can fill up the others.
Absolutely. Yeah. I don't want to be beating the age old drum of saying go to the gym, a couple days a week, get better sleep, eat healthier. I mean, these are things that we all intuitively know how to do, and yet we're still also bad at it. I mean, I am also not that great at it. And so I also have to be more intentional about how I approach it. And what I recommend for people is to figure out what does work best for you. There is no one size fits all solution. But what I hope to bring light to people is this general framework for self assessment. So, not everybody needs to go to the gym and work out 3 days a week for an hour. Each time. Some people just need to go out and get a little bit of sun, walk around the block. Maybe you can be on your phone, listen to a podcast, something like that, a little bit of
I like it.
exercise, go out with some friends. And the physical capacity out of the four of them, I think, is one of the ones that does spill the most into the other ones.
Ah,
So, not everybody needs to get 8 or 9 hours of sleep. There are some people, and there's a lot of research that suggests that there are some people that benefit and work at their maximum capacity at 5 or 6 hours of sleep. And so, figuring out what your baselines are for yourself and what is the minimum that you need to be a functioning adult day to day without being tired, without being agitated, so that you can start focusing on these other aspects. And we also find that social capacity is a huge one, making sure that we have a social support system. That doesn't necessarily mean that we need to have a big circle of friends, but making sure that we have, at least one or two other people that we can talk to when times are tough, that we can vent to, that we can even gossip with. There's a lot of really good research that's come out recently on the positive effects of gossiping.
really?
And so there are these two primary capacities, I think, of physical and social, that if we're a little bit more intentional about what we need in them. Maybe some people that are extroverts need a lot more, right? They need to go out clubbing or go engage in a hobby, some of the like a paint and sip where they're talking with a bunch of new people and building up, kind of refilling your cups, so to speak. And I really do like this idea of a cup metaphor when I talk about the capacities,
Mhm.
because we've kind of always been like, I'm filling my cup up too much or it's overflowing. But really, I think it's
Yeah.
four cups, all the way from something as small as a shot glass up to a big Stanley cup, possibly. Some of us have way more capacity in some things, and some of us have much smaller amounts. And so we don't want to overflow, but we also want to make sure that we're filling it up enough so that we're serving ourselves more appropriately.
Wow. I love that. And I when I watched your TED talk, I saw the cup metaphor and I really liked
Mhm.
that because, and I want you to touch on this is,
Mhm.
like I'm married to someone who's a little bit more of an extrovert. He needs a little more social time. I need a little bit more quiet time. So if you can touch on, and just even in any type of relationship, my best friend is a super extrovert. I'm a super introvert. So how do you have communication dialogue to be able to make sure that each person is getting what they need, at certain times? Do you have any advice for our listeners on that?
I do. I do. I'm a big proponent of radical candor, and even applying that outside of the business world, applying that in the personal settings as well. I study ethics and ethical leadership, and a big key piece of that is just transparency. And I think people, generally speaking, are not that great at boundary setting. I think we could, as a species, be much better at boundary setting. That's why we have so many issues. But I
True.
think starting with transparency and candor is how you start to find the line for boundaries between either yourself and your significant other, or you with friends. You say you're an introvert. I'm an extrovert. My partner, she's an introvert. And so, sometimes it becomes a negotiation. It's not like, we're at the table and we're having an intense negotiation about what are we going to do this weekend? Are we going to go out with some of our friends? Are we going to stay in and binge watch something? But it's like, finding and striking that balance with the people that we care about, because it's less about my friend's an extrovert or my friend's an introvert. That friend in of themselves are the ones that tap into your personal social capacity. So if you're hanging out and talking and being transparent with them, you're reducing any friction just in that immediate relationship. And so then now you have a transparent, open line of communication, and then you just negotiate from there openly.
I love that. That's so great. And I love what you said about boundaries, because that is something that when I've led teams and everything, it is the hardest thing to coach, is like setting boundaries well. And then when you add the transparent component, that's really the thing that's also missing. So thank you for sharing
Yeah.
that. So also in your TED talk, you talked a little bit about, I think you actually said the line like professional help is okay to get. And so when you talk about
Yes.
this social capacity and having friends, I know a lot of people that listen, we're all going through some of these transitions where, we're becoming, I follow Joe Dispenza and he talks about your personal reality is your personality. And so you're kind of going
Absolutely.
through these shifts as you shift your mindset. And so it can be hard to find people to talk to when you're going through this change. So talk a little bit about the benefit of having a therapist, and then, how we get over the fear of cost, the fear of judgment. And
Yeah.
then for type A's of like, I can do it myself. I don't need anybody.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you right off the bat, I am absolutely type A. I'm very much a I can do everything myself type of person. And my personal philosophy for how to approach that is, we know that when we talk about money, just a quick analogy, when we talk about money, time is something that is mostly on your side, right? With investments and assets. I think the exact same thing applies to capacity. So when we say I can do it myself, of course, I'm sure you can, eventually you'll be able to do it yourself. But what you're wasting there is valuable time that you're not going to get back. It is an investment in yourself to work with a professional. I tell a lot of the organizations that I work with that, the value of a consultant is saving time, and in business, time is money. Fortune 500 companies go out of their way to hire consultants from these big, expensive consulting firms, even though they have a lot of that expertise in house, and they could probably do it on their own. But they know that hiring professionals with expertise in that area is going to grease the wheels and make everything a little bit more expedited. And the same exact thing I think applies to therapy and working on yourself individually, making sure that you're in a growth mindset. I think, most people think, well, I can do it myself and I'm going to get better on my own. They think that's a growth mindset. But what you're really doing is you're closing yourself off from being challenged, and you get siloed in that individual perspective, like you said. And so working with a professional, a therapist, a coach, whatever it may be, at least helps you get that third party perspective. Isn't somebody as immediately close as a friend or family member who also, is a little bit biased towards you. And I think there's a big issue in the mental health space around this idea of fear of the work. People don't want to be exposed. It's a very vulnerable state to be in. For any of your listeners who, are haven't preemptively watched my TED Talk, which I believe is most of them probably listening to this podcast. In high school, I dropped out of high school, and I suffered through some serious depression, and I started to work with a therapist. I was inpatient for a little bit, and I've been working with a couple different therapists over my time, even through my professional career, through graduate school, to help through those times, because it is not time that I am going to get back trying to figure it out myself. Getting that professional help, I think, is the biggest investment that you can do for yourself to get to that future state that you want to be in much sooner.
Oh, that's fantastic what you just said, because there are so many things there that I think would resonate with the audience. But it's, time is a big thing that, as a working mom, we all focus on. And so I love that that's at the core of this. Is if you're struggling with time, I mean, investing in opening yourself up, because that is the other thing that I wanted to touch on. You're going to save time, ultimately save money, and get to where you want to go, because at the end of all this, the Happy Life Agenda is about getting to your happiest life. So that's an amazing thing that you just shared there. Now, one of the things that I want to also touch on is you said something about, challenging yourself. And if you're closed off, you aren't able to do that. And I believe in your TEDx talk, you also talked about making mistakes is where we find the growth. When we lean into our challenges, that's where we find the growth. And a lot of us in our own internal dialogue, even if we never say it out loud, even those of us that are like, I can do it myself, there's some dialogue of I can't because I don't have enough money or because I don't have, the right access to people. So can you talk a little bit about, that going ahead and trying and learning from that as a part of self-assessment and growth?
Yeah, absolutely. Something that I've told to some of my students is that mistakes that we make along the path, that is the tuition that we pay for success and growth.
Like that.
Mistakes are the things that we learn the most from. There's tons of psychological science that show that when we make a mistake, it actually has more positive effects on our behavior and our learning than avoiding the mistakes altogether. Because the mistake is so salient, it basically puts us on a course correction going forward. I mean, if we look at some of the most successful people of our time or even throughout history, they have failure after failure
Mhm.
along their career path in those early days of their careers. And that was because they weren't afraid to make mistakes and they quickly learned from them. Just from my prior answer, I mean, this is also a time investment thing. If you make the mistakes sooner, that means you will be successful sooner because you will know how to not make that mistake again. We usually don't make a mistake more than 2 times on average. We're very adaptive and we're very correctable, just as a species, right? As human psychology. And so because of that, when we get comfortable enough in ourselves to take a risk, success is usually just right on the other side of that discomfort, whether it's a couple months down the line or a couple years down the line, depending on what you're trying to pursue.
Mhm.
Those mistakes that you make are ultimately going to be the biggest benefit that you're going to have for whatever your final goal is, if you're truly passionate about it.
Wow. Wow. That puts such a good, I don't know, bubble around mistakes because like
Mhm.
that's probably the hardest thing to overcome. Even just like as young children, when they start to recognize that I have a young daughter that's in that phase where she's starting to recognize what a mistake is and being wrong. And so I just really love the way that you framed that. So
And
now
if you
let's,
don't
oh, yeah,
if you don't
go ahead.
mind, real quick, I
Yeah.
would just invite your listeners to just take a moment and really kind of, if they don't mind, and if you don't mind, to even just close their eyes for a second and sit in what it would feel like if it didn't matter if you made a mistake. You get to make mistakes. You have the permission to make mistakes. What would it really feel like for you to kind of relieve some of that societal pressure on making a mistake? And then just moving from it, right? Ownership is the biggest thing that we learn from leaders, and some of the best leaders, Fortune 500 companies, and political leaders. That what we love about them so much, the ones that we like, is that they own their mistakes, the personal
Yes.
responsibility aspect. So if we just own those mistakes and roll with them, others will too. We're usually our harshest critics when it comes to it.
Absolutely. I think I've shared this story on another podcast, but I had planned, a really big event and it was my first time to try to plan an event like that. And I mean, made a lot of mistakes along the way and I ended up, having to cancel it, which felt really, scary and embarrassing. But in all of that, trial and error, I learned
Mhm.
so much. I met so many people
Yeah.
that have gotten me to the next stage in my business. And if I hadn't have gone through with that big scary thing, and though it failed, I learned so
Mhm.
much from it. So I don't consider it a failure and it helped me get to the next level. So I love, just what you're saying here is don't be afraid to fail. And it can
Yeah.
even make you more likable, it sounds like.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it can. Yeah. Yeah.
That's awesome. So now I want to kind of shift gears a little bit from the
Sure.
individual to organizations, because obviously you're an
Yeah.
organizational psychologist and just the things that we're seeing, the job market's really bleak. A lot of
Yeah.
organizations are still kind of operating in an old school model because our government, our schools still do. So how are you helping, people navigate change within an organization so that employees can be happier? And
Mhm.
even if you're somebody who's job hunting, you feel like you're going to be walking into an organization that recognizes your creativity and your gifts. Can you just take us through a little bit of that consciousness that's required these days?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'll try to keep it as brief as possible too.
We may have to do
Um,
another episode.
yeah, yeah, totally, totally. So, for any listeners that aren't aware, organizational psychology really is the practice and focus of making work better. And what I try to focus on and do in my work when I'm consulting or doing research, I focus on organizational justice and ethics because, my core philosophy around it is that if we create just and ethical systems within organizations, not only are we going to have a better reputation and people are going to want to take our services and take our products because we're known as being ethical and they know that we're going to do right by our customers, but we have employees that are going to want to work with us, that believe in our mission, that feel trusted and cared for by the organization. So what I really try to put into motion for organizations and for leaders is ethics and strategy. So using ethics strategically. I think there's sometimes a little bit of hesitancy with organizations. They're like, well, I don't want to bring in anybody who's going to be looking at our ethics and calling us out. It's another sort of fear of the work thing from the individual level. But at the end of the day, investing in your people so that they're happy to be where you're working, so that you create a transparent environment for your people to work in, is what's going to be ethical long term for the services and products you provide. You could possibly have a simple mission of, we're going to create X product for Y population, right? Something very simple. But at the end of the day, if you're doing it ethically, you're taking care of your people, you're transparent with your customers, and you're not price gouging them in the store, then at the end of the day, you're going to have a lot more adopters and you're going to be much more competitive over over the other organizations out there that are price gouging.
Wow. You just like brought it back full circle, is like transparency and communication with individuals, transparency within an organization. And I think, I've been in some leadership consulting meetings, and, they talk about in the United States, like, we're not really good at confrontation because with transparency comes some of those conversations that are difficult. Calling it confrontation sounds kind of like argumentative, but it's really not. It's about being able to, I think you use the word candor, to be able to just kind of speak our minds a little bit, but in a respectful way so that we can move the needle forward. So can you give us just a few like tidbits on, how to have those difficult conversations in an organization, especially if you're an employee talking to your leader where something needs to change?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we know one of the, from tons of research and tons of case examples, that one of the biggest hurdles for employees to speak up is toxic work culture. And I'm sure many of your listeners are familiar with toxic work culture, probably firsthand,
Yes.
Unfortunately. But creating a space as an employee, if you really like the place that you work at and it's a place that you want to stay at, going to your leader, your supervisor, whoever it may be. And I do think that this tactic does work in reverse as well in group meetings from a leadership perspective too. And that is simply putting it right up in front and saying, I want to have a difficult conversation about something. What you're doing is you're immediately priming everybody in the room, or you're priming your supervisor to be cognitively and emotionally ready to have a difficult conversation. And people are usually not going to say no unless it is genuinely not a good time and they don't have the time to have that conversation. But people will usually say yes in a business setting. Can we have a difficult conversation about something? There's something I want to talk to you about. There's something that I'm concerned about. Because if you are coming from the perspective of wanting to improve the organization, to improve a process, to make the workplace better, then you most likely are not going to be penalized by your organization for trying to do so. And if you approach it in a very honest, matter-of-fact, candid way, where you're not coming out and saying, I think we should fire this person, right? If you're doing it in a very genuine approach and manner, then usually that's reciprocated by the organization. It's just that people tend to have this fear of bringing up problems because a lot of employees, either because of a toxic work culture or because of their own personal reputation, don't want to be the person that's bringing up problems time and time again. But I'll tell you, as a leader myself, running a clinic, and from so many leaders that I've talked to, leaders like the people that point out problems, because that is the type of person that you want in your organization, because that is who has the energy to want to fix problems. And organizations are about solving problems. We create products and services to solve problems for consumers, and a leader's job in the organization is to solve problems internally so that we can reach and achieve our mission. So I would tell any employees that are listening to this, bring up the problems, make sure that you're approaching it in a level-headed way, but saying, hey, can we have a tough conversation? I'm a little bit concerned about, X, Y, and Z. And I think leaders can do the same thing.
That's phenomenal advice. I mean, everything that you just packaged there was really great because, some of the questions that were going through my head and you answered them just as you were speaking. And that is, why organization exists in the first place. What is the role of a leader? And then being open to those difficult conversations. Now I'm going to ask you one more question because this has been brought to my attention by some of my listeners recently that are, struggling a little bit with some toxic work culture. And that is, a lot of organizations get stuck in that endless meeting cycle, right? And so the leaders are perpetually unavailable all the time. And you've got something that is a difficult conversation that's almost pressing. Do you have any advice for employees to be able to get the time and attention of their leader, especially when it's something that's a difficult conversation that needs to be had sooner rather than later?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first thing I'm going to say, which is not going to be super helpful and is a very common consultant response, which it depends and context matters, but I do want to give something tangible that is helpful. And so whether you're in a small organization, say a team of a dozen, or you're in a large Fortune 500 company with thousands of people spread around globally, there is usually somebody that you are the direct report of in your organization, or there's some sort of policy or system to get information up the ladder. If you're in a medium or large organization, that is HR. And we have a generally negative connotation with human resource departments. But I will tell you right now, that is the job of HR, is to help solve problems within the organization, especially information issues. And so bringing it up to HR, you can probably assume that in most organizations that are medium to large size, that is going to make its way up the ladder. But if you're in a smaller organization that doesn't have a sort of policy in place or an enforcement mechanism for moving information through the organization, then usually I think a lot of employees feel like, well, I've emailed them, I've texted them, I've put urgent in the subject headline, what can I possibly do from there? And when we talk about change management, I also teach strategic change management courses and have worked with some organizations around change management. A big piece of it is coalition building. And so when you're a employee that is lower level and you don't have too much power or leadership roles, what you really need to start doing is coalition building with people that are either below you or directly next to you, and say, hey, I think this is a problem. Do you agree that this is a problem? What do you think about it? And so what you kind of are starting to do is run an awareness campaign. And it's a little political, but it is very simple at the same time. You just bring awareness. You don't need to move it up the ladder. You move it out to the sides. And then if everybody becomes aware of the problem, in due time, it will make its way up as soon as that leader has availability.
Wow. Okay, that's so interesting. I have not heard this perspective before, but I like the way you called it an awareness campaign, and really
Yeah.
trying to just bring to light something that is a shared frustration.
Yeah, and in some cases, you might find, well, this is something I'm very worried about, but nobody else is. And somebody may actually talk you down. They say, oh, well, did you consider this and this? And you go, you know what? You're right. I didn't consider that and that. I might have gotten overly invested and misunderstood what was going on. So thank you. So talking about it with some of your peers can either immediately resolve the problem, or build enough of an awareness to pass that threshold so that action gets taken.
Love that. And it goes again full circle to that being open and new perspectives and
Yeah.
what we were talking about on the individual side of things. So
Yeah.
wow. I love it. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Attaway, for being on today. This has been such a fun conversation. And I truly think that we could talk much more in depth on,
Oh, I think so too.
businesses and organizations.
Yeah.
So that means
Yeah.
I think I just need to have you on for another episode specifically to talk about that,
Sounds
because
good.
since I started the Happy Life Agenda, I started as, this mindset shift and this individual
Mhm.
pursuit, but it has become more and more inherent that we need to talk about what's going on in organizations, because, where we're at right now, a lot of people are needing help and advice on that. And you gave some
Absolutely.
really, really great advice today. So thank you.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome. So before we wrap up, I would love for you to
Mhm.
share with everyone who's, listening and who would be interested in getting in touch with you. Can they follow you on
Yeah.
social media? Do you have a website? Can you share all of that with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're an individual or an entrepreneur or a business that would like to connect with me, I do have a website. It's just austinattaway.com. Nice, clean, and easy. And Attaway is two T's, Attaway. And then if you want to follow me on Instagram, you're more than welcome to. That's Dr.Attaway. So Dr.Attaway. And I'll be starting to post on there some insights, in the mental health space and in the ethics and business space as well. And then if you'd like to keep up with anything that I'll be doing in the future, I do have a book coming out next year. So you can follow me on Instagram to stay in the loop with that as well.
Oh my gosh, that's so exciting. Well, to all of our listeners, I will be posting all of the links to Dr. Attaway's social media. And as his book comes out, we'll be staying in touch with him so he can come and tell us about that as the launch gets closer. And so thank you again, Dr. Attaway, for joining us. Thank you all for listening today. And I want each of you to remember that, the Happy Life Agenda is dedicated to creating change that empowers you to live the life that you want. So that means that we often have to shift with inside ourselves, but also look outside of ourselves, just like Dr. Attaway said today, and ask, who can I reach out to for help, or how can I help someone? And you can be the catalyst for change. So if you're struggling with your job and you need inspiration, or you finally want to start your own business, the group of people that I have on my podcast and that are on my website, we're all here to help you. So please reach out to us on social media. We have lots of fun conversations that go on all week long once we post a podcast. And if you need support for yourself or for your company, then make sure that you reach out to me or to any of the experts that I've had on my podcast, like Dr. Attaway. So I'll leave you all with that. Be sure to jump in the conversation on social media. Click subscribe below if you love this conversation. And thank you again for tuning in. Y'all have a good one.